There's a new push at the State House to scale back on incarceration and the number of people going back to prison. There's agreement among elected officials in both main parties, but advocates would like to see more headway on criminal justice reforms. One of them is our guest, the director of the Racial Justice Program for the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts, Rahsaan Hall. Thank you very much for being with us again, Rahsaan.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
I'll put this into perspective with the numbers is that some people say that our crime problem isn't that big, our incarceration problem is maybe even smaller, and then we got all this recidivism. So put that into perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's appropriate and fair to acknowledge that Massachusetts has the second lowest incarceration rate in the nation, but can we really celebrate being the best of the worst? Because Massachusetts, although we may be the second lowest incarceration rate in the country, we far outpace other industrialized nations like Japan and Australia and Uruguay and Spain and France. And so we can't really say that we're doing such a good job when an entire nation has a better incarceration rate than we do.
Because the other story is that even within Massachusetts, we're a state with different worlds. If you live near Franklin Field, what's that world like, and how does that compare to the rest of us?
Sure. I think Mass Inc. just recently put out a report, and it showed where people are returning from prisons to, and the geography of incarceration, essentially. And it showed that certain neighborhoods, every other house, there was somebody that was formerly incarcerated. And so when you have a concentration of people who have been incarcerated, and you have kind of a lack of economic opportunities in those neighborhoods and an increased level of policing there, you're more likely to see a lot of people cycling in and out of the system. And that's one of the things that the Council for State Governments was invited in to look at were the recidivism rates. The problem is there's a need to really address what's happening on the front end of the criminal justice and really look at sentencing reform.
Explain that, because for a long time the easy assumption is, well, if there's a lot of crime there, then you're going to have a lot of incarceration. But talk about what are we missing when we do that?
I mean, I think one of the things that we're missing are what are the reasons why people are involved in criminal activity, and then is some of the activity that people are involved in necessarily things that need to continue to be criminal. So, when you look at the lack of economic opportunities, the low quality education that people have access to, those are some of the things that contribute to people being sucked into the criminal justice system. I think it's probably like 2/3 of the people who are in the criminal justice system have mental health and substance abuse issues. And so if we're not treating those things, we're going to use the criminal justice system as a default treatment method, as opposed to, instead of dealing with those things as a public health issue, we deal with them as a criminal justice issue.
This is BNN News. We're talking with Rahsaan Hall from the Mass ACLU. What about the racial disparities?
So it's pretty disturbing. Like I said, a lot of the legislators and officials in law enforcement like to celebrate the fact that we have such a low incarceration rate, but it's problematic because even though our rate is low, we have some of the worst disparities in the nation. Blacks and Latinos make up roughly 22% of Massachusetts' population, but we make up 57% of people who are serving sentences or are incarcerated, and we make up 75% of the people who are serving mandatory minimum sentences on drug offenses. And then when you look at weapons charges, that's 81%. And so when there is this type of racial disparity, somebody needs to take a close look at it and find out what are the drivers of those disparities. And this process that we just recently went through the state legislature with the Council of State Governments, and they issued this report, one of the recommendations was that they continue to do a deeper and more thorough analysis of the racial disparities. But the legislation that the governor introduced with the support of the Speaker of the House and the Senate President doesn't include anything to really look at those racial disparities.
Well, with some of these mandatory sentences, yes, you can have somebody in prison for a long time, even though they've never done anything violent. But, DAs like these sentences. They said they use them as a leverage to get defendants to plead to other charges.
Absolutely. I'm a former prosecutor. I served for 8 years in the Suffolk County DA's office. And one of the things that we always did was operated from what we perceived was a position of strength. So every time that there was an enhancement or a mandatory minimum charge, we pursued that. We charged that. And that gave us the leverage to, get people to plead guilty. Because why face a 10-15-year sentence when you can take 3 years? Why roll the dice on a jury of 12 people that you do not know at all, and who knows what they're thinking about you or what biases or prejudices they may have, and risk a lengthy sentence. And so that's another thing. The district attorneys themselves will argue, well, there really aren't that many people serving sentences on mandatory minimums, which is somewhat true. There's about 868 people currently serving sentences on mandatory minimum drug offenses. But for every one person that is serving a sentence on one of those offenses, there were 2 other people that were charged. And what that says is that those people are pleading guilty at the discretion of the prosecutor, who will dismiss the enhancement or the mandatory minimum only if the person pleads to the sentence that the DA is recommending, not an impartial and unbiased judge who has sworn to uphold the Constitution, but a prosecutor.
Even when people finish their time in prison or house of correction, they're still going to be faced with court fees, probation fees, and how much of a problem is that as far as people ending up back behind bars?
That's a significant issue. There was a report recently issued by the Senate Post Audit Committee that looked at what we call fine time, individuals who are brought back into court and then sometimes incarcerated because they were unable to pay a fine or a fee, whether it is the assessment of counsel for people who cannot afford an attorney. Even though they can't afford an attorney, the court assesses them a $150 fee. And if they're unable to pay that, the court can bring them back in and hold them for contempt of court for failing to pay those fines and fees. And there are a significant number of people who are, held on those things, or, people who are held on bail. They are still innocent until proven guilty. And the only reason they're being held is because they cannot afford the bail that's been set. So those are some issues that are significant as well.
Chris, one other challenge here is, in addition to this, is you've got some people who need more help with programs. It sounds like we got to go and look for some more money for that.
Yeah, and so what this proposal, the report from the Council for State Governments does is it lays out this projection over 6 years. It's essentially a $35 million investment to yield about a $10 million return. But what that investment is in programming, treatment, diversion programming, substance abuse, work readiness training. The problem is we have to trust and rely that the legislature and the governor are going to continue to make those significant investments over the years. And instead of looking at repeal of mandatory minimum or reform of bail or reform of solitary confinement or juvenile justice diversion programs, all which are separate freestanding bills that have been filed by the legislature, we're hoping that those things get addressed, and we're going to advocate for those things to get addressed. But instead, the bill that the governor introduced focuses on the back end, creates good time and credits for people who are serving sentences, and does a few other things, but it really doesn't get to the core. And so we need to continue to push and advocate to make sure there are those types of programming.
I want to see if I can have you take a temperature or reading of the climate here in the State House, because when I saw the announcement of this by the governor and the leaders of the House and Senate, I still saw at least a significant reluctance to tamper with mandatory sentencing. And yet at the same time, reading states like Florida, you've got progressive Democrats and conservative Republicans doing just that.
Yeah, here's one of the things, and the District Attorneys Association are really good for touting some of the success that was seen by reducing some of the sentencing predicates for mandatory minimums, reducing the range for a school zone, and reducing the amount of time served for certain drug offenses. And they said when we did that in 2013, we saw a decline in the incarcerated population. But yet and still, they want to hold on to the mandatory minimums out of this false notion of protecting the public from evildoers. And the reality is that if we saw those declines by reducing the thresholds for weight or the amount of time or the distance in a school zone, we could see so much more decrease in the incarcerated population if we completely remove them. But prosecutors recognize that that is their leverage, so they won't have to try every case. And there's a bit of fear mongering that goes on by saying, well, we need to make sure that that the people who are being prosecuted are the traffickers. In Massachusetts, trafficking weight for Class B, which is cocaine, or Class A, which is heroin, is 18 grams. 18 grams is 4.5 packs of sugar that you could get from Dunkin' Donuts. So we really need to have a realistic conversation about who's in there, what they're in there for, and then what the prosecutors the DAs derive from having the leverage and power behind the mandatory minimum sentences.
Well, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Rahsaan Hall from the Mass ACLU. We'll have more news in just a moment.